My daughter said I wasn't emotionally stable enough to attend my husband's funeral. A week later, at the will reading, she laughed. "You won't be needing a seat." I nodded and quietly handed the lawyer my revised version. But let me tell you how it really started, 3 days before Harold's funeral. I was sitting in our bedroom, the same room where Harold and I had shared 43 years of marriage, staring at the black dress I'd bought for this day I never wanted to come. The fabric felt heavy in my hands, like it already knew the weight of grief it would carry. Victoria walked in without knocking. She never knocked anymore, not since Harold got sick. "Mom, we need to talk." Her voice had that tone, the one she used when she was about to tell me something I wouldn't like but was expected to accept anyway. I looked up at her, my only daughter, standing there in her expensive pantsuit with her arms crossed. When did she become so cold? When did I stop recognizing the little girl who used to crawl into this very bed during thunderstorms? What is it, sweetheart? Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching. She sighed, like I was already being difficult. About Dad's funeral, Paul and I have been discussing it and we think it would be better if you didn't attend. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my chest tighten, my breath catching somewhere between my lungs and my throat. "What do you mean?" "You've been so emotional lately, Mom. So unstable. Dad's funeral is going to be important. His business partners will be there. The mayor, people from the country club. We can't have you making a scene." Making a scene. As if grieving my husband of 4 decades was some kind of performance meant to embarrass her. "Victoria, he was my husband. And he was our father," she snapped back. "But Paul and I have reputations to think about. We've worked hard to build our positions in this community. We can't have you falling apart in front of everyone who matters. Everyone who matters." I wondered if I had ever mattered to her at all. "I won't fall apart," I said quietly, though my voice was already shaking. "I just want to say goodbye." Victoria's expression softened slightly, but not with compassion, with pity. "Mom, you've been saying goodbye for months. All those hours sitting by his hospital bed, holding his hand, talking to him when the doctors said he couldn't even hear you anymore. Wasn't that enough?" No, it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But how could I explain that to someone who saw love as weakness and grief as an inconvenience? "Besides," she continued, "you'll have your own private moment. We'll arrange for you to visit the funeral home before the service. You can have all the time you need without anyone watching." Without anyone watching. Like I was something shameful that needed to be hidden away. I wanted to fight. I wanted to stand up and tell her that I had every right to be at my husband's funeral, that no one knew Harold better than I did, that I had earned my place beside that coffin through decades of love and devotion. But the fight had gone out of me months ago, worn down by Victoria's constant suggestions that I was becoming a burden, that I wasn't thinking clearly, that maybe it was time to consider other living arrangements. "Paul agrees with me," she added, as if that settled everything. "He thinks you're not in the right headspace to handle something this public." Paul, my son who called once a month if I was lucky, who hadn't visited his father in the hospital until the very end, who was suddenly so concerned about my well-being. "What about what I want?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. Victoria's face hardened again. "Mom, this isn't about what you want. This is about what's appropriate, what's best for everyone involved. What's best for everyone." I was beginning to understand that everyone didn't include me. I looked down at the black dress in my hands, the dress I'd picked out specifically for this day, and felt something inside me break. Not just my heart this time, but something deeper, some essential part of me that had always believed that family meant something, that being a wife and mother earned you certain rights, certain respect. "Fine," I whispered. Victoria's shoulders relaxed. "I'm glad you understand. We've already arranged everything. The service is at 2 o'clock. Paul will pick you up at 4 after everyone's gone, and you can have your private time then. After everyone's gone. After all the people who mattered had paid their respects and moved on with their lives." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Oh, and Mom, we'll need to talk about the house soon. It's really too big for just you and the expenses." She shrugged. "Well, we'll figure it out after the funeral." Then she was gone, leaving me alone with my black dress and the dawning realization that I had just been erased from my own husband's farewell. I sat there for a long time after she left, holding that dress and thinking about the woman I used to be, the woman who had raised 2 children, who had supported Harold through every challenge in his career, who had made this house a home for over 4 decades. When had I become so invisible that my own children could simply decide I didn't belong at my husband's funeral? The answer came to me slowly, painfully. It had been happening for years, so gradually that I hadn't noticed until it was too late. Every time Victoria suggested I was getting confused about small things. Every time Paul agreed that maybe I shouldn't drive at night anymore. Every time they exchanged those looks when they thought I wasn't watching. The looks that said she's losing it. I wasn't losing anything. I was having it taken away from me, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left. But almost nothing isn't the same as nothing at all. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Harold's lawyer. The call to Harold's lawyer, Robert Fleming, had been brief. I'd known Robert for 20 years. He'd handled our house purchase, Harold's business contracts, our previous wills. When I explained what Victoria had done about the funeral, the silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "Margaret," he finally said, his voice careful, "I think you and I need to have a conversation. Can you come to my office tomorrow?" I almost said no. Victoria had made it clear that I wasn't supposed to make any important decisions without consulting her first. But something in Robert's tone made me agree. The funeral came and went without me. I watched from the bedroom window as cars lined our street, as people I'd known for decades filed into the church where Harold and I had been married. Victoria had been right about one thing. It was well attended. Harold had been respected in this community, loved even, and I wasn't there to see him honored. Paul picked me up afterward, just as Victoria had promised. The funeral home was empty except for us and the director, who looked uncomfortable as I approached the casket. Harold looked peaceful, finally free from the pain that had consumed his last months. I touched his hand one last time and whispered goodbye to the only man who had ever truly seen me. "Are you done?" Paul asked after 10 minutes, checking his watch. He had somewhere else to be, as always. 3 days later, we gathered in Robert Fleming's office for the reading of Harold's will. Victoria arrived first, of course, dressed in a sharp business suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She'd brought her husband, Richard, which surprised me. Paul came alone but late, sliding into his chair with an apology that didn't sound sincere. "Where should Mom sit?" Paul asked, scanning the chairs arranged around Robert's conference table. Victoria glanced at me dismissively. "She can sit over there," she said, pointing to a single chair positioned slightly behind the main group, like I was an observer rather than Harold's widow. I took the seat without protest. I'd learned to pick my battles, and this wasn't one I could win. Robert opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents. "Before we begin, I want to express my condolences again. Harold was a good friend as well as a client." Victoria nodded impatiently. "Thank you, Robert. Now, about the estate. Yes, well, Harold's will is fairly straightforward." Robert cleared his throat and began reading. "To my son Paul, I leave my collection of golf clubs and the sum of $25,000. Paul's face fell slightly. I could tell he'd been expecting more. "To my daughter Victoria, I leave my mother's jewelry and the sum of $25,000. Victoria's sharp intake of breath was audible. "That's it?" Robert continued reading. "The remainder of my estate, including the family home, all investment accounts, and my life insurance policy, I leave to my beloved wife, Margaret." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's face had gone pale, then flushed red. Paul was staring at the documents like they contained a mistake. "There must be some error," Victoria said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Dad wouldn't have left everything to Mom. She can barely manage her own checkbook anymore." That stung, but I said nothing. It wasn't true. I'd been managing our household finances for 40 years, but I'd learned that defending myself only made Victoria more convinced of my incompetence. "I assure you, there's no error," Robert said calmly. "This will was prepared 6 months ago and is perfectly valid." 6 months ago? Victoria's voice rose. Dad was already sick 6 months ago. He wasn't thinking clearly. "Actually," Robert said, "Harold was quite clear about his intentions. He came to me specifically because he was concerned about certain pressures he was feeling from family members." I saw Victoria and Paul exchange a look. They knew exactly what pressures Robert meant. "This is ridiculous," Victoria snapped. "Mom can't handle an estate this size. She'll make terrible decisions, probably get scammed by some con artist. Dad couldn't have wanted that." "Perhaps we should discuss the specifics of the estate," Richard interjected, speaking for the first time. Victoria's husband was always more interested in numbers than emotions. Robert nodded and began listing Harold's assets. The house, worth nearly $400,000. The investment portfolio, worth another $300,000. The life insurance policy, $250,000. By the time he finished, Victoria looked like she might be sick. "This can't be right," she whispered. "Dad promised us the house. We've been planning..." "Planning what?" I asked quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken since we'd arrived. Victoria turned to me, her composure cracking. "We've been planning to sell it. Mom, it's too much house for you, and the money could pay for a nice assisted living facility. Somewhere you'd be taken care of properly." Assisted living. So that was their plan. Get me out of my home and into some facility where I'd be even more dependent. Even more controllable. "I don't need assisted living," I said. Mom, be realistic, Paul jumped in. You're 73 years old. You can't maintain a house that size by yourself. And all this money, you'll need professional help managing it. Professional help, meaning them. The will is clear, Robert said firmly. Margaret inherits everything. What she chooses to do with it is entirely up to her. Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. Dad was manipulated somehow. Mom probably pressured him when he was weak and confused. The accusation hit me like a slap. After everything I'd done for Harold during his illness, the sleepless nights, the doctor's appointments, the medications I'd organized and tracked, she was suggesting I'd taken advantage of him. Victoria, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, your father was never confused about his love for me or his trust in my judgment. Trust in your judgment? Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mom, you asked me 3 times last week what day it was. Another lie, designed to make me doubt myself. I'd asked her once what day of the week our grocery delivery was scheduled, but in Victoria's version, it became evidence of my mental decline. I think we're done here, Robert said, gathering his papers. Margaret, when you're ready, we can discuss the transfer of accounts and assets. There's no rush. Victoria's face was stone cold as she grabbed her purse. This isn't over. If Mom isn't competent to manage this estate, there are legal remedies. We won't let her destroy everything Dad worked for. Legal remedies. Was she actually threatening to challenge my mental competency? Victoria, Richard said quietly, putting a hand on his wife's arm. Let's go. As they filed out, Paul paused beside my chair. Mom, you know we're just looking out for you, right? We don't want to see you get overwhelmed or make mistakes. I looked up at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and supported through every challenge of his life, and saw a stranger. I know exactly what you want. Paul. After they left, Robert and I sat in silence for several minutes. Margaret, he finally said, there's something else. Harold left a sealed letter for you. He asked me to give it to you privately, after the will reading. He handed me an envelope with my name written in Harold's familiar handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. My dearest Margaret, it began. If you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've just heard my will. I know Victoria and Paul are upset. I know they expected more, but I need you to understand why I made this choice. The letter was 2 pages long, and by the time I finished reading it, tears were streaming down my face. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of vindication, of love that extended beyond the grave. Harold had known. He'd known everything. I drove home from Robert's office in a daze, Harold's letter clutched in my purse like a lifeline. The house felt different when I walked in. Bigger somehow. Emptier, but also more mine than it had felt in months. Victoria's key was still on the kitchen counter where she'd left it after going through Harold's papers to help organize things. I picked it up and dropped it in the junk drawer. She wouldn't be needing it anymore. I made myself a cup of tea with shaking hands and sat at the kitchen table where Harold and I had eaten breakfast together for 4 decades. Then I read his letter again, slowly this time, letting every word sink in. My dearest Margaret, it began. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've just heard my will. I know Victoria and Paul are upset. I know they expected more, but I need you to understand why I made this choice. For the past year, maybe longer, I've watched our children treat you like you're already gone. Like you're some burden they're stuck with instead of the woman who raised them, who sacrificed everything for their happiness. It breaks my heart, Margaret. It breaks what's left of it. Victoria thinks I don't notice when she talks to you like you're a child. She thinks I don't hear her telling people that you're getting confused or not quite yourself lately. She's been doing it for months, planting seeds, making people think you're losing your mind. But I see you, sweetheart. I see you clearly, and you're the same sharp, capable woman I married 43 years ago. Paul isn't much better. He calls it concern, but what he really means is control. They both want to put you somewhere safe and manageable where they can visit you once a month and feel good about themselves for being such devoted children. I've been pretending not to notice because I didn't have the strength to fight them while fighting this cancer. But I'm not leaving you defenseless, my love. Everything I've built, everything we've built together, it's yours. Not because I don't love our children, but because I trust you to know what's right. There's something else you need to know. 3 months ago, Victoria came to me with papers. Guardianship papers. She said it would be easier for everyone if she had legal authority to help with your affairs. She said you'd asked her to do it, that you were worried about making mistakes. I knew you'd never ask for that, Margaret. You've always been too proud, too independent. So I told her no. Absolutely not. She got angry, said I wasn't thinking clearly either, that maybe we both needed someone to watch out for us. That's when I knew I had to protect you legally. I changed the will that week. I also did something else. I had Dr. Peterson document my mental state. Full cognitive evaluation. I'm of sound mind, Margaret, whatever they might try to claim later. Be strong, my darling. Don't let them convince you that you need taking care of. Don't let them make you small. With all my love, Harold P.S. Check the safe deposit box. Box 247 at First National. Robert has the other key. I read the letter 3 times before the full impact hit me. Victoria had tried to get guardianship over me while Harold was dying. She'd actually gone to a lawyer and had papers drawn up to take away my legal rights. The thought made me physically sick. And the safe deposit box. Harold had never mentioned a safe deposit box. We'd always kept our important papers in the filing cabinet in his study. What could be so important that he'd hidden it away? I called First National the next morning and made an appointment to access the box. The bank manager, Mrs. Chen, had known Harold for years and offered her condolences before escorting me to the vault. I have to ask, she said as we walked down the narrow hallway lined with boxes. Are you planning to close the box? I don't know yet. I just found out it existed. She gave me a curious look, but didn't ask any more questions. Box 247 was larger than I'd expected. Inside, I found a thick manila envelope marked, "For Margaret's eyes only," in Harold's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first document was a letter from Dr. Peterson, Harold's oncologist, dated just 2 months before Harold's death. It was a formal assessment of Harold's mental capacity, stating clearly that despite his physical illness, his cognitive function remained completely normal. The letter specifically mentioned that Harold had requested this evaluation because family members have questioned his judgment regarding financial and legal matters. The second document made my blood run cold. It was a copy of the guardianship petition Victoria had filed. She'd actually gone through with it, despite Harold's refusal to sign. The petition claimed that both Harold and I were suffering from diminished capacity due to age and illness, and that immediate intervention was necessary to protect our assets. But the most shocking part was the list of supporting evidence she'd compiled. Doctor visits I'd allegedly missed but hadn't. Medications I'd supposedly forgotten to give Harold but had never been prescribed. Bills I'd apparently left unpaid that I'd never seen. She'd created an entire fictional narrative of my incompetence. The petition had been dismissed when Harold's lawyer filed the cognitive evaluation, but seeing it in black and white was devastating. My own daughter had been building a legal case to have me declared incompetent. There were more documents. Bank statements showing that Victoria had been asking detailed questions about our accounts, claiming she needed the information to help manage things. Credit reports that had been pulled without our knowledge. A real estate appraisal of our house that I'd never authorized. She'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. While I'd been caring for her dying father, she'd been systematically documenting every small mistake, every moment of confusion that comes with stress and grief, and turning them into evidence that I couldn't be trusted with my own life. The last item in the envelope was another letter from Harold. This one shorter, but somehow more devastating. Margaret, I hired a private investigator. I'm sorry, but I had to know how far this was going. The report is here, but I want to prepare you. Victoria has been telling people you have early-stage dementia. She's convinced half the neighborhood that you need constant supervision. She's also been in contact with Sunset Manor about placing you in their memory care unit. Paul is in on it too. They've been planning to sell the house and split the proceeds after paying for your care. They think I don't know, but sickness doesn't make you stupid. I love our children, but I won't let them destroy you. You're stronger than they think, Margaret. Show them who you really are. I sat in that sterile bank vault surrounded by evidence of my children's betrayal and felt something I hadn't felt in months: anger. Pure, clean anger that burned away the fog of grief and confusion I'd been living in. They'd been planning to erase me from my own life. While I'd been worried about being a burden, they'd been actively working to make sure I became one. Every time Victoria had suggested I was getting confused, every time Paul had agreed that maybe I shouldn't drive at night, every time they'd exchanged those worried looks, it had all been theater. A performance designed to gaslight me into believing I was losing my mind. But Harold had seen through it. Harold had protected me. I gathered all the documents, locked them back in the safe deposit box, and drove home with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. When I pulled into my driveway, Victoria's car was already there. She was sitting on my front porch, her face a mask of controlled fury. "We need to talk, Mother." The word mother came out like an accusation. She only called me mother when she was angry, when she wanted to remind me of my place in the hierarchy she'd created. "Yes," I said, walking past her to unlock the front door. "I think we do." She followed me inside, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors Harold and I had refinished together 20 years ago. "I've been thinking about what happened at the lawyer's office," she said, settling herself on the couch like she owned it. "And I think we need to discuss having the will contested." I turned to face her, Harold's letter still fresh in my mind. "On what grounds?" Dad wasn't thinking clearly toward the end, Mom. The medications, the pain, the stress of being sick. He obviously wasn't competent to make major financial decisions. The irony was staggering. She was accusing Harold of the exact thing she'd been trying to pin on me. Your father was completely competent when he made that will, Victoria. Dr. Peterson confirmed it. Her confidence faltered slightly. How do you know about Dr. Peterson? I know a lot of things. We stared at each other across my living room, and for the first time in months, I didn't look away first. The silence in my living room stretched between Victoria and me like a wire pulled tight. She was waiting for me to break, to crumble under the weight of her disapproval the way I always had before. But something fundamental had shifted in me during that drive home from the bank. Harold's letter had shown me the truth, and the truth had set something free inside me that I'd forgotten existed. Mom, you're not being reasonable about this, Victoria said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. I understand you're upset about Dad's death, but you can't let emotions cloud your judgment about practical matters. Practical matters. She made my grief sound like a character flaw. What practical matters are those, Victoria? This house, for starters. It's far too much for you to handle alone. The yard work, the maintenance, the property taxes, and all that money Dad left you. You'll need professional guidance to manage it properly. Professional guidance. Meaning her guidance, of course. I've been managing our household finances for 40 years. I think I can handle it. Victoria's laugh was sharp, dismissive. Mom, that was different. Dad was there to help you, to catch any mistakes. Now you're on your own, and honestly, you haven't been as sharp lately as you used to be. There it was again, the constant undermining disguised as concern. But now I knew it for what it was. A deliberate campaign to make me doubt myself. Give me an example, I said calmly. What? Give me an example of when I haven't been sharp. Something specific. Victoria shifted uncomfortably on the couch. Well, there was last week when you called me 3 times asking what day the grocery delivery was coming. I called you once to confirm the day because you'd changed it without telling me. The delivery service called to verify the new schedule. Her cheeks flushed slightly. You're being defensive, Mom. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't admit when you're struggling. I walked to the kitchen and returned with a folder I'd taken from Harold's filing cabinet that morning. Inside were bank statements, investment reports, tax returns, all the financial documents Victoria claimed I couldn't understand. Tell me what I'm struggling with, I said, spreading the papers on the coffee table between us. Show me where I've made mistakes. Victoria glanced at the documents but didn't touch them. It's not about mistakes you've made, Mom. It's about mistakes you might make. At your age, with everything you're going through, at my age. I'm 73, Victoria, not 93. And what exactly am I going through besides the grief of losing my husband and the stress of having my own children treat me like I'm incompetent? We don't treat you like you're incompetent. Don't you? I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app. Let me see. In the past month, you've suggested I shouldn't drive after dark, that I shouldn't make any major decisions while I'm grieving, that I should let you handle the insurance paperwork because it's too complicated for me to deal with right now. You've taken over Harold's medical bills, his prescription refunds, even the thank you cards for the funeral flowers. When exactly did I become so helpless that I can't write a thank you note? Victoria's mouth opened and closed like she was searching for words. I was trying to help. I was trying to take the burden off you during a difficult time. No, you were trying to establish a pattern. You were trying to create evidence that I needed constant help with basic tasks. The color drained from her face. That's ridiculous. Why would I do that? I stood up and walked to Harold's desk, retrieving the folder Robert Fleming had given me that morning. Inside was a copy of everything from the safe deposit box. I'd asked him to make duplicates so I could keep the originals secure. Because you filed a guardianship petition against me 3 months ago, Victoria went completely still. How do you know about that? Your father knew about it. He documented everything, Victoria. Every lie you told, every piece of false evidence you tried to create, every conversation where you tried to convince people I was losing my mind. I placed the guardianship petition on the coffee table in front of her. She stared at it like it was a poisonous snake. Mom, you don't understand. I was trying to protect you. From what? From having control over my own life? From making mistakes that could ruin your future? From people who might take advantage of you? From yourself? The last phrase hung in the air between us, and I finally understood. This wasn't about protecting me at all. This was about Victoria's need to control everything around her, including me. I need to ask you something, I said, sitting back down across from her, and I want an honest answer. When did you stop seeing me as your mother and start seeing me as a problem to be solved? Victoria's composure cracked slightly. That's not fair. Answer the question. She was quiet for a long moment. And when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. You don't understand what it's like, Mom, watching you and Dad get older, knowing that someday we'll have to make decisions about your care. Paul and I have our own lives, our own families to think about, so you decided to make those decisions now, while you still could. We decided to be proactive instead of waiting for a crisis. You decided to create a crisis so you could swoop in and save the day. Victoria stood up abruptly, her mask of concern finally slipping completely. Fine. You want the truth? Yes, I think you need supervision. Yes, I think you're going to make mistakes with Dad's money. Yes, I think living alone in this big house is dangerous for someone your age. And yes, I think Paul and I are better equipped to handle the family's financial affairs than you are. There it was, the truth I'd been waiting to hear for months. And the part where you told half the neighborhood I have dementia, the part where you researched memory care facilities without telling me, the part where you tried to have me declared legally incompetent, was that also being proactive? Victoria's face hardened. I never said you had dementia. I pulled out another document from Harold's folder, the private investigator's report. According to this, you told Mrs. Henderson next door that I'd been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. You told your book club that I'd been getting confused about medications. You told the pharmacist that I might try to pick up prescriptions I'd already collected. Victoria sank back down onto the couch, her defiance crumbling. People talk, Mom. Sometimes things get exaggerated. No, Victoria. You planted those stories deliberately. You needed witnesses to your narrative that I was becoming incompetent. We sat in silence for several minutes. Victoria stared at her hands while I watched her. This woman I'd raised and loved and supported through every challenge of her life. When had she become someone I didn't recognize? What do you want from me? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I want my daughter back, I said. The one who used to trust me to know what was best for myself. I can't do that, Mom. I can't pretend I don't see what I see. What do you see, Victoria? Because from where I'm sitting, you see a problem that needs to be managed instead of a person who deserves respect. She looked up at me then, and for a moment I saw something that might have been regret in her eyes. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. The will contest is going forward, she said, standing up and gathering her purse. Paul and I have already spoken to a lawyer. We have evidence that Dad wasn't competent when he changed the will. No. You don't. We'll see about that. She walked toward the front door, then turned back. And Mom, you might want to start thinking about alternative living arrangements. This house is going to be tied up in legal proceedings for months, maybe years. You won't be able to sell it or make any major changes. The court might decide you need a guardian after all. The threat was clear. Even if she couldn't get the will overturned, she could make my life miserable enough that I'd eventually give up and give her what she wanted. After she left, I sat in my empty house thinking about the woman Victoria had become. Somewhere along the way, my successful, intelligent daughter had decided that love meant control, that caring meant taking away someone's choices for their own good. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated me. I picked up the phone and dialed Robert Fleming's number. Robert, it's Margaret. I need to ask you about something. When Harold hired that private investigator, did he happen to document Victoria's conversations with potential care facilities? He did. Why do you ask? Because I think it's time Victoria learned that actions have consequences. Robert Fleming's office had become my sanctuary over the past week. While Victoria and Paul scrambled to build their case against Harold's will, I'd been quietly building something of my own. The private investigator's report had been even more damning than I'd initially realized. She contacted 7 different facilities, Robert said, spreading the documented phone calls across his desk. Sunset Manor, Golden Years, Peaceful Gardens, Heritage House. In every conversation, she identified herself as your daughter and claimed you'd been diagnosed with early-stage dementia. I stared at the transcripts. The investigator had been thorough. Each call was dated, timed, and summarized. Victoria had been shopping for a place to put me while Harold was still alive, while I was still caring for him around the clock. This one is particularly interesting, Robert continued, pointing to a call from 6 weeks before Harold's death. She told the administrator at Sunset Manor that you'd recently had an incident where you left the stove on and nearly caused a fire. That never happened, I know. The investigator verified your daily routine during that period. You were at the hospital with Harold from 8 in the morning until 9 at night every single day. You weren't even using the stove. The methodical cruelty of it took my breath away. Victoria hadn't just been planning to have me declared incompetent. She'd been creating an entire fictional history of dangerous incidents to justify immediate placement in memory care. There's more, Robert said, She also contacted your bank, claiming she was worried about unusual account activity. She filed a complaint with Adult Protective Services alleging financial exploitation. Financial exploitation? By whom? By you. She claimed you were withdrawing large amounts of cash and couldn't account for where the money was going. I felt dizzy. What large amounts? Robert pulled out bank statements. The $400 you withdrew to pay the cleaning lady in cash. The $600 you took out to pay Harold's physical therapist who didn't accept checks. The $300 for the grocery delivery service that only accepted cash during the pandemic. Every withdrawal had been legitimate, necessary, documented, but Victoria had painted them as evidence of cognitive decline or potential financial abuse. The APS complaint was dismissed when they couldn't find any evidence of actual wrongdoing, Robert continued, but it's still on file. She was building a paper trail, Margaret. If Harold hadn't died when he did, she might have succeeded in having you placed under guardianship while he was still alive. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Victoria hadn't just been planning for after Harold's death. She'd been planning to remove both of us from control of our own lives. What about their legal challenge to the will? Robert smiled grimly. That's where it gets interesting. Their lawyer filed the petition yesterday. They're claiming Harold lacked capacity due to his illness and medication. But we have Dr. Peterson's evaluation. We do, but they have something else. They've submitted testimony from 3 witnesses who claim Harold was confused and disoriented in his final months. What witnesses? Robert consulted his notes. Victoria herself, Paul, and surprisingly, your neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. Mrs. Henderson. The woman I'd considered a friend for 15 years. The woman who'd brought me casseroles after Harold's diagnosis and offered to help with errands. Mrs. Henderson is claiming that Harold asked her the same questions repeatedly during their conversations, that he seemed confused about what year it was, and that he once told her he thought you were his sister, not his wife. The lies were so outrageous they would have been funny if they weren't so dangerous. Harold had barely spoken to Mrs. Henderson in his final months. He'd been too weak, too focused on fighting his illness. They're committed to this, Robert said. Victoria has hired Thompson, Burke, and Associates. They're expensive and they're good. This isn't going away quietly. I took a deep breath. Then we don't let it go away quietly. What do we need to do? Robert leaned forward. We counterfile. We challenge Victoria's standing to contest the will based on her documented attempts to manipulate both you and Harold. We introduce the guardianship petition as evidence of her ulterior motives. And we expose her fabricated evidence for what it is. What about Mrs. Henderson? The investigator is still working on that, but I suspect we'll find that Victoria coached her testimony. People don't usually lie this elaborately without help. Over the next 3 days, I did something I hadn't done in months. I fought back. Not with tears or pleading or attempts to make my children see reason, but with facts and documentation and the cold, hard truth. I called Dr. Peterson and asked him to prepare a detailed timeline of Harold's mental state throughout his illness. I contacted the hospital staff who'd witnessed our daily interactions and asked them to provide statements about Harold's lucidity and our relationship. I even called the cleaning lady and the physical therapist to document the legitimate reasons for my cash withdrawals. But the most difficult call was to Mrs. Henderson. Margaret, dear, she said when she answered, her voice artificially warm. How are you holding up? I'm doing well, thank you. I was wondering if you had a few minutes to talk. Of course, dear. You know I'm always here for you. I walked over to her house, something I'd done hundreds of times over the years for coffee and conversation, but this time felt different. This time, I was walking into enemy territory. Mrs. Henderson's living room was exactly as I remembered it. Overstuffed floral furniture, doilies on every surface, the persistent smell of lavender air freshener. But the woman sitting across from me seemed like a stranger. I understand you've been speaking to lawyers about Harold, I said without preamble. Her face flushed. Oh, Margaret, I hope you don't mind. Victoria asked me to share my observations about Harold's condition in his final months. She said it might help with some legal matters. What observations were those? Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. Well, he seemed confused sometimes when we talked. Asked me the same questions over and over. When did you talk to Harold? Oh, when I'd see him in the yard, or Harold hadn't been in the yard for 6 months before he died, Eleanor. He was too weak to walk outside. The flush deepened. Well, perhaps it was earlier than I thought. And when did he tell you he thought I was his sister? Mrs. Henderson's hands fluttered nervously. I might have gotten that confused with something else someone told me. Someone like Victoria? The silence stretched between us. Finally, Mrs. Henderson sighed. Victoria was very concerned about you both. She said Harold was getting confused and you weren't coping well with the stress. She thought it would be helpful if people who cared about you could document what they'd observed. So she asked you to lie. She asked me to remember conversations I'd had with Harold. Conversations that never happened. Mrs. Henderson stood up abruptly. I think you should go, Margaret. I was only trying to help. Help who? Me? Or help Victoria get what she wants? I left Mrs. Henderson's house feeling sick but oddly relieved. Another piece of Victoria's careful construction was crumbling. That evening, Robert called with news. The investigator found something interesting. Mrs. Henderson received a $5,000 deposit into her checking account 2 weeks ago, the same day she gave her statement to Victoria's lawyers. Victoria paid her. It appears so. We can't prove the money was specifically for false testimony, but the timing is suspicious enough to raise questions in court. What about Paul? Has he been paying witnesses too? Paul is interesting. The investigator says he's been reluctant to go along with Victoria's more extreme claims. He'll support the will contest because there's money involved, but he seems uncomfortable with the outright lies. That sounded like Paul. He'd always been weak rather than malicious, more interested in avoiding conflict than creating it. Victoria was the driving force behind this campaign. There's something else, Robert continued. Victoria made a mistake. She contacted Sunset Manor again yesterday, apparently forgetting that we'd already documented her previous calls. This time she told them you'd had another incident, that you'd gotten lost driving to the grocery store and called her crying because you couldn't remember how to get home. I don't drive to the grocery store. I have everything delivered. I know. And the investigator verified that you haven't driven anywhere except to my office and the bank in the past month. Your car hasn't been out of the garage. Victoria was getting desperate, creating increasingly elaborate lies without thinking them through. The careful facade she'd maintained for months was cracking under pressure. We have enough, Robert said. Between the documented lies, the paid witness, the false APS report, and the guardianship petition, we can paint a clear picture of Victoria's motivations. She wasn't protecting you or Harold. She was systematically undermining both of you to gain control of the estate. I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not hope that my children would suddenly become the people I'd raised them to be, but hope that I could stop them from destroying what Harold and I had built together. When do we file? Tomorrow. And Margaret, you should prepare yourself. When Victoria realizes what we have on her, she's going to get ugly. People like her don't go down quietly. As if on cue, my phone rang. Victoria's name appeared on the screen. Mom, we need to talk. Paul and I are coming over. I don't think that's a good idea, Victoria. It wasn't a request. The line went dead. I looked at Robert, who had heard the entire conversation. Do you want me to stay? He asked. I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. No, I think it's time I handled my children myself. They arrived exactly 30 minutes later, Victoria striding through my front door like she owned it. Paul trailing behind with the uncomfortable expression he always wore when his sister was about to do something he knew was wrong but wouldn't stop. Sit down, Mom, Victoria said, not bothering with pleasantries. We need to discuss your situation, my situation, as if my life were a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be respected. I'm comfortable standing, I said. This won't take long. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Paul and I have been talking to our lawyer. We're prepared to offer you a settlement. A settlement? Drop your opposition to the will contest. Agree to move into assisted living, and we'll make sure you're comfortable for the rest of your life. Full medical coverage, a nice apartment at Sunset Manor, a monthly allowance for personal expenses, an allowance, like I was a child being offered pocket money for good behavior. And in exchange, the house gets sold, the assets get properly managed, and everyone gets what they deserve, Paul said, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. What they deserve. Not what I deserve, but what they deserve. I see. And if I refuse this generous offer? Victoria's mask of reasonableness slipped. Then we proceed with the legal challenge. We have witnesses, Mom. People who've seen you struggling, who've documented your confusion and poor judgment. We can drag this out for years. Tie up every penny of Dad's estate in court costs. Is that really what you want? What I want, I said calmly, is for my children to stop treating me like I'm already dead. We're not treating you like you're dead, Paul protested. We're trying to protect you. From what? From having control over my own life? Victoria stepped closer, her voice dropping to the patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. The stress of Dad's death, your age, the medications you're taking, they're all affecting your judgment. You need help making these decisions. What medications, Victoria? She paused. Your prescriptions. The ones Dr. Morrison prescribed for your anxiety and depression. I've never seen Dr. Morrison. I don't take medication for anxiety or depression. The lie hung in the air between us. Victoria had fabricated even that detail, probably planning to use it as evidence of my mental decline. You're confused, Mom. You've been taking those pills for months. No, Victoria. You're the one who's confused. Confused about who has the power here. I walked to Harold's desk and pulled out the folder I'd prepared. Let me help clarify things for you. I spread the documents across the coffee table. The guardianship petition, the transcripts of Victoria's calls to care facilities, the bank records showing the payment to Mrs. Henderson, the false APS report, the investigator's findings about her fabricated stories. Victoria went pale. Paul leaned forward, reading over the papers with growing alarm. Where did you get these? Victoria whispered. Your father was more aware than you thought. He documented everything you did, every lie you told, every attempt to manipulate him and me. He knew exactly what you were planning. Paul picked up the guardianship petition, his face ashen. Victoria, you told me this was just a precaution. You said Mom had asked you to look into it. I was protecting her, Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. You were protecting yourself, I corrected. You were so afraid of not being in control that you were willing to destroy your own parents to get what you wanted. Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. You don't understand what it's like, watching you and Dad get older, knowing we'll have to take care of you someday. Do you have any idea how much it costs to care for elderly parents? How much it would disrupt our lives? There it was. The truth I'd been waiting to hear. This had never been about my well-being or Harold's. It had been about Victoria's fear of inconvenience, of responsibility, of having her perfect life disrupted by aging parents who might need actual care. So you decided to solve the problem before it became your problem, I said. I decided to be realistic about the future. You decided to steal it. Paul was staring at his sister like he'd never seen her before. Victoria, some of this stuff, telling people Mom has dementia, paying Mrs. Henderson to lie, filing false reports, this isn't protecting anyone. This is fraud, I finished, and elder abuse, and conspiracy. Robert Fleming assures me that all of these actions have legal consequences. Victoria's face went white. You can't prove any of this. I picked up the bank statement showing her payment to Mrs. Henderson. Can I? The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stared at the evidence of her own schemes, perhaps finally understanding that her careful manipulation had been documented every step of the way. What do you want? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I want you to withdraw the will contest. I want you to stop spreading lies about my mental health, and I want you to leave me alone to live my life in peace. And if we do that, then these documents stay in Robert Fleming's safe, and we never speak of this again. Victoria looked at Paul, who was still reading through the papers with obvious disgust. Victoria, he said quietly, this has to stop. What you've done here, it's wrong. It's really wrong. For a moment, I thought I saw something that might have been remorse in Victoria's eyes. But it passed quickly, replaced by the cold calculation that had driven her actions for months. Fine, she said. We'll withdraw the contest, but don't expect us to pretend this is a happy family anymore. I stopped expecting that months ago. They left without another word, Victoria marching out with her dignity intact, but her power broken. Paul following with his head down like a child who'd been caught doing something shameful. After they were gone, I sat in my quiet house and felt something I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember. Peace. Not the peace of resolution or reconciliation, but the peace of knowing that I would never again have to justify my existence to people who saw me as a burden rather than a person. Harold's letter was still in my purse, and I read it one more time, focusing on his final words. Be strong, my darling. Don't let them convince you that you need taking care of. Don't let them make you small. I hadn't let them make me small. I had fought back, and I had won. 6 months later, I was sitting in my garden, the same garden where Harold and I had spent countless hours planning our future, when my phone rang. It was Paul. Mom, I wanted to call and apologize. For everything. Victoria was wrong, and I was wrong to go along with it. Thank you, I said simply. Are you doing okay? Living alone in the house? I'm doing very well, Paul. Better than I have in years. There was a pause. Maybe I could visit sometime, if you'd like. I'd like that. And I meant it. Not because I needed his approval or his help, but because I had learned the difference between people who wanted to control me and people who actually cared about me. Paul had made mistakes, but he wasn't beyond redemption. Victoria never called, and that was fine too. I had Harold's love, my dignity, and my freedom. At 73 years old, I had finally learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go, not of life, but of the people who would make it smaller than it needs to be. The house was quiet, but it wasn't lonely. It was mine.